Hello, I'm your host, Brandy McCrae, for the podcast Nurturing a Child's Consciousness. This is a podcast about relationship, consciousness, and well-being, especially as those realities live in children and the adults who care for them. This is a space to explore wholeness. Each episode invites us to look at how we know our world and how children know theirs. What becomes possible when relationship, rather than performance, becomes the foundation? If you're a parent, an educator, a caregiver, or simply someone who can feel that life holds more than just managing and getting through the day, you're in the right place. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today's podcast theme is trust as a developmental ground, raising self-trust. We focus on how children develop self-trust and why it forms the foundation for healthy relationships later in life. We connect early relational experience with autonomy, discernment, and the ability to form satisfying partnerships. But we have a challenge. Trust is a feeling wisdom. How are we going to talk about that today?
I want to start with a simple but overlooked truth. Capacities are innate. Development depends upon relationship. Self-trust is one of those innate capacities. But whether it develops, how strongly it develops, the way it develops, depends upon the relational environment surrounding the child. When we talk about trust, most people immediately think about trusting others, trusting partners, trusting institutions, trusting friendships. But from a natural learning relationships perspective, that's not where trust begins. It begins as self-trust. Development of trust, of course, begins at the moment of birth, and hopefully all of the early developmental needs have been met, as we've discussed in our last podcast about body being and the needs for loving touch and security. Trust begins as an internal human capacity that needs to be nurtured in relationships. So the question for adults is simply, what relationships nurture trust and when? Feeling being begins with the awareness of personal mortality. I die. I ask you all listeners, please think about it for a second. Personal mortality. Doesn't that open us up into profound feeling relationships? Doesn't that bring us closer and more intensely needing others to support one another and to make our way in life? As the field of knowing opens up, the child becomes more aware of feelings and the relationships with others.
But this reminds me, as you were speaking about the awareness of personal mortality, that I die, and how that opens us up. In feeling being, it begins that feeling wisdom of the feelings of others and my feelings and connection to others and connection to nature. It reminds me, recently I was traveling to the Netherlands to visit friends, and I haven't seen these friends in over a decade. And they have a son, an 11-year-old son. And his favorite thing right now is playing with English. So he's watching all these YouTube videos, learning English, and was so excited to meet and speak with me. As we were speaking, one day we were walking to the beach, and he was asking about where I live. And I was telling him about where I live and how we do sea turtle conservation and all these different things and about the environment. And he started to really challenge and push back. And it was such an incredible feeling being moment of him saying, like, well, what about mosquitoes? That was his challenge back, is mosquitoes, they're connected to each other. And, you know, you're doing all this conservation for sea turtles, but then we just splat and kill a mosquito like it's nothing. Are mosquitoes nothing? And yet we're trying to save all the sea turtles. And it was just a beautiful playground, and that feeling wisdom that, you know, what are connections? What does that mean? Not just with myself, but the whole world. And this feeling wisdom around death and mortality and what that means, not just for ourselves, but for everything that we're connected to and everything that's connected to one another. It was such a beautiful reminder of what is awakening in a feeling being child.
Josette here. So what we're really asking is, how do we raise self-trust? And then we're also asking, what kinds of relationships help a child to trust their own inner experience? From a natural learning relationships perspective, self-trust isn't about confidence or performance at all. It's much deeper than that. It's organism-based. It's the ability to feel something, recognize it, stay connected to it, and respond without collapsing into fear or self-doubt or the need for constant outside approval. Self-trust also includes the ability to make mistakes. That's important. A child who trusts themselves can adjust and learn and keep going. In natural learning relationships, a fully functioning human isn't someone who gets everything right. It's someone who can stay open to their experience and make course corrections when needed. So how does that develop? Well, it develops when a child's inner experience is consistently met by trustworthy people in trustworthy relationships. So when a child feels something, someone is there to receive it. When they express something, someone responds honestly and respectfully. And when they make choices, they're allowed to experience outcomes without ridicule, without hypocrisy, absolutely no shame. That's not permissiveness, that's relational integrity. And we actually see this pattern very clearly in families. When parents are cooperative, children tend to become cooperative. When parents are trustworthy, children learn trust. When parents' needs are treated as legitimate, they begin to value both their own needs and the needs of others. So, self-trust is never built in isolation. It grows inside reciprocal relationships. A child does not learn self-trust because we tell them, trust yourself. They learn it because they're in relationship with adults who are emotionally present, authentic, and consistent. And children are incredibly sensitive to incongruence. If an adult says one thing but lives another, the child feels that split. They internalize it, and that weakens trust.
Josette, as you just shared about self-trust, and it makes me think, for example, in having that playful exploration with my friend's 11-year-old around connection and how we give things value based on their life, like the life of the mosquito versus the life of the sea turtle. You're saying that that builds his own self-trust, the 11-year-old self-trust, being able to have this conversation with an adult and really explore what those things mean and his own internal experience of questioning what is actually valuable here? What is going on here? Why do we behave this way as humans? Why do we value one life form over the other? Is that what you're saying there, Josette?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. That you entertained with him his engagement in this dilemma of mosquitoes versus sea turtles. That was perfect. Now we can start to see the bigger picture. Self-trust develops when a child can experience the full range of his feelings or her feelings in the presence of a caring, in this case you, trustworthy adult who can help them navigate those feelings without shutting them down. You didn't make fun of him. You didn't say that was silly. So because emotional intelligence is not just emotional expression, it's discernment, it's learning, it's the child saying, what am I actually feeling? What does this feeling really mean? And what action fits this feeling? That kind of discernment only develops through lived relationship like you had with him. Carl Rogers, the psychologist from humanistic psychology talked a lot about fully functioning person as someone who's open to all of their experiences and afraid of none of their feelings. That's a self-trust. But that kind of functioning doesn't happen in isolation. It grows in relationships where the child is seen and valued and allowed to make choices, allowed to experience consequences, and guided without fear or conditional approval.
So, Josette, you just brought up the term emotional intelligence, and I think we have to stop for a moment there and be with what we really mean by emotional intelligence. I appreciate it so much you and Brandy have brought that self-trust is the basis of emotional intelligence. But emotional intelligence also creates meaning. That is, a child who trusts themselves will go ahead and try to create the meaning in the world around them. And the innate part of the capacity is what we call conscience. And it's very scary that the way conscience is conditioned and taken over by outside forces. I'd like to make an analogy here. For instance, if you're in a place with body being children who are babbling, if you were behind a screen and there were 6 different children from 6 different ethnic backgrounds babbling, you could not tell which child came from which ethnic background. The innate capacity is speech, but it's there in an open, easy way, waiting to be developed in ways, and the child will do so in order to establish rightful place and belongingness and connection with the world and the people with whom they're living with. In the same way, in feeling being, the capacity, the operating capacity is conscience. Conscience is the ability to discern meaning in the relationships. And just as with a body being child developing language, so here the child is open. And we talk so often about what extraordinary vulnerability in the feeling being years, the vulnerability of I die, the vulnerability of how do I process, how do I organize all the feelings that I'm feeling. So we can take Raj's brilliant insight into the ability to feel all the feelings. Now, how is the child to make meaning out of that? And this is the responsibility, and in my opinion, the sacred responsibility of all people who interact with feeling being children, to understand that the relationship is actually developing not just the sense of self-trust, but the meaning they'll make in the world of themselves and how they engage their social and relational life. And that is extraordinary. That says so much about how we discern, reducing conscience to good and bad, reducing it to it should be this and you ought to be that, and you should look this way, and all the shoulds that get placed upon the child constrain and almost cauterize the incredible ability of conscience to take in all those feelings and make a place of trust for themselves in the world. So you named all these wonderful ideas, understandings about authenticity and so on, Josette. But if there's excessive fear, hypocrisy, or judgment in the child's life, then they will actually look through the lens of searching for fear instead of searching for trust. They will believe that meaning has to include this unnecessary suffering of fear and judgment.
You've begun to talk about fear instead of searching for trust and this unnecessary suffering. I know in my own personal experience, the feeling qualities of betrayal versus the feeling qualities of trust. And you also spoke about feeling being, which is around the ages 8 to 12, that this capacity, this development of their conscience is open. So, how does betrayal and trust relate to that emotional metabolism that's developing?
Brandy, when we think about it and consider it, the words betrayal and betroth both come from the same root as the word trust. Josette and I, we've led so many seminars, and time after time, people will tell us the worst feeling in the world is betrayal. And it is, because we have extended trust in some situation. Even institutional betrayal, religious betrayal, any betrayal, it strikes us. We know that well-being has been wounded. And we try to rally around it by coming up with different mechanisms, different behaviors to take care of ourselves, to preserve trust. But that's work that we shouldn't necessarily have to do. Betrothed, on the other hand, means not just that we're going to marry or we're married, but that we join in this deep kinship, in this wholeness that says, this is who we are together. And in that togetherness, we make meaning out of a way of life that both respects our agency, but has something bigger, something synergistic, something more whole in the betrothal.
So, we've talked about emotional metabolism. We've talked about a lot of things when it's concerned or related to the development of trust. I think one thing that's really important to bring to the table here is the importance of inspiration. Children, especially between the ages of 8 and 12, need experiences that awaken a sense of awe and meaning and wonder and connection. And when children have access to beauty and nature, meaningful stories, music, art, adventure, or deep conversations about life and death, something shifts internally. They begin to trust not only their own feelings, but their place in the larger scheme of things, their place in the larger whole. Inspiration can certainly come in many forms, and it doesn't have to look grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's sitting around a fire after a long hike, or it could be a conversation after an inspirational movie. Sometimes it's standing quietly together at a sunrise as we watch it together. Inspirational journeys are also very important. These trips should be conducted completely around providing the inspirational experience for the child, not tacking it on to another trip for business or with a different focus that's arranged for other reasons, but really making it a deep focus and inspiration. And there's many ways to provide inspirational experiences with children. There was, for example, nature experiences, backpacking into the wilderness, catching a sunrise after a pre-dawn hike to the top of a mountain, perhaps discussions on the subject of death, attending services at several different types of religious institutions to see how they all handle death, arranging a private audience with a leader to discuss their viewpoints on the subject of death. Another one is engaging the child in community service projects with teamwork or in a different ethnic neighborhood. Music, art can also stimulate feelings of inspiration, especially when experienced in the company of a trusted elder or in a community with discussion following. They open the door to feeling experiences of transcendence. Transcendence is very important. It's the feeling that we're connected to something larger than ourselves. And for a child, that can happen in a very simple moment. Like we said, watching a sunrise or standing quietly in a nature forest, feeling deeply moved by music or a story, experiencing love, awe, beauty, connection, realizing that they're a part of life, family, community, or the universe in a very meaningful way. It's not necessarily religious. It's more the experience of wonder, connection, and meaning beyond everyday concerns. Without experiences like that, children often develop a kind of hunger for meaning. And when that hunger isn't met, they'll often attach themselves to substitutes that provide identity but not true grounding. That can look like over-identifying with peer groups or celebrity culture or social media personas, influencers, over-attaching to achievements or ideologies of different sorts and kinds, even constant stimulation and distraction. Those things can temporarily give a child a sense of belonging or identity, but they don't necessarily create an inner sense of meaning, connection, or self-trust. True grounding comes from lived experiences of connection, feeling connection to nature, family, community, to beauty, to compassion, to something larger than oneself. Without that deeper grounding, children can become very vulnerable to looking outside themselves for worth, for validation, for direction, or for identity. Inspiration and transcendence together. Death no longer looms as a fear when a child's developmental needs have been met in this way, with opportunities for these kinds of direct experiences of transcendence and inspiration. This potentially allows for trust of something greater. Inspirational experiences deepen emotional metabolism. They deepen empathy, compassion, and trust in self. And it makes life sacred because it's related to empathy and compassion, and that can come to fruition much later in development as well.
And Josette, it also sets the stage for social justice awareness. And Brandy, your conversation earlier about the mosquitoes and the turtles is a complete social justice awareness statement. But one thing I want to add to that is that if the parent, the elder, the teacher feels inspired, that also inspires the child. And you, no doubt, knowing you are an inspirational person, you live your inspiration. I know you do. You're painting, sailing. You're an amazing person. That in itself is inspiring. I'm inspired, as perhaps you can hear it in my voice, and I'm sure the young person with whom you were talking also felt inspired by it. That's beyond the social justice concerns that were being brought forth. Yet, at the same time, social justice awareness happens for so many feeling being children who are well nourished. Nature clubs are quite common. Concern for elderly. I know we did some help with some of the unhoused people in our community when our grandkids were this age, and they were completely into it. When we ran a school, we did an amazing thing. We have a local organization, quite a good one, that takes in and helps some mental health challenged people, and especially if they're unhoused. And we did a program where we created a game, a certain kind of game, I won't go into it, in which people could see that you could become unhoused for many, many reasons. So we brought forth the social justice aspect. Then we set it up with this organization so that we went down to the organization and they treated our students as if they were an intake. And so they went through the exact process that some of these unhoused people would go through who had mental challenges. And kids, they loved it. They were in awe. And it had, where was inspiration? It was in this wonderful organization's intake center. So social justice really matters, and it matters a lot to these children. And to have the opportunity to express it and experience it is one of the healthiest things we can do.
That's beautiful description, Bob. And it brings to my mind, we also need to talk about the importance of love. It's the most important ingredient because from a developmental perspective, love is not just an emotion. Love is actually the condition that makes healthy human development possible. Our last episode in our podcast, we talked about Umberto Maturana's work, and I want to emphasize it here a little bit, that love is the foundational emotion that enables connection, learning, and wisdom. Without love, development fragments. And with love, development organizes. So when we talk about raising self-trust, we're really talking about creating conditions of love, which is an emotional environment where the child feels valued, connected, safe to experience themselves fully, and supported in their growth.
I'll pause here for a moment because we have something really exciting to share. So many of you have reached out asking how to get involved or how to explore this work more deeply. And we're happy to say that in July, we're launching the Natural Learning Relationships Introductory course. This 7-week experience offers an introduction to the ideas we explore here on the podcast. So child development, relationships, well-being, and the innate capacities that unfold through human development. People often tell us that this work transforms not only the way they see children, but the way they understand themselves and their relationships and the people around them. This introductory course can be taken on its own, or it can serve as the first step in our 12-month certificate program, which includes 10 courses and a practicum. And because this work is deeply relational, we intentionally keep the cohort very small. Enrollment for the July cohort is already open. Folks are enrolling and participation is capped at 8 people. If you'd like to learn more or express interest, visit transformativedynamics.org and fill out the interest form, or check the links in the show note. One more thing. Thank you to everyone who's already sending questions and reflections about the podcast. Every few episodes, we'll be setting aside time to respond to listener questions directly on the show. You can send questions or comments through the contact form on our website or by emailing Ba directly, ba@lovemoreconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to the conversation. We've talked about cooperation and trust and emotional metabolism. As you talk about love, I'm curious, how is self-trust the foundation for healthy partnership later in life?
Great question. There's something really important that happens for adults in this process. And I've talked about it a little bit before, but as we create the conditions for children to develop self-trust, we often begin reclaiming parts of ourselves too. I saw this over and over again in the research that I did for our family programs. Many parents talked about becoming more aware of their own feelings as they supported their child's emotional development. One mother in particular comes to mind. Her name was Maria. She described growing up in a very controlling environment where there wasn't space for feelings for whatever reason, I don't know. But she talked about turning toward anorexia because it gave her a sense of control. And then later, while raising her own daughter, something began to shift. She said, and this is a quote, As I work to give my daughter the sense that she doesn't need permission to stand in her own feeling, it bathes me in that same right. It's a really powerful statement, she said. So she also said she learned how important simple presence really is. Just staying with her child emotionally helped her to realize how deeply she herself longed for that kind of presence in her own childhood. So I think that's one of the hidden gifts here, that when adults genuinely support a child's emotional well-being, it often deepens their own self-trust too. Trust in their own intuition, trust in their own feelings, trust in relationship. And in that way, development becomes reciprocal. We might even call it bidirectional, but in natural learning relationships, we often call it mutual development.
I think, as I've mentioned before, Max, my son, is 10 and in this feeling being world, and I can relate to how my own emotional metabolism has changed as I develop trust with Max as he's playing in this field, and how that's reawakened my own sense of trust and self-trust and what that means, and maybe things I carried over from childhood that I would make jokes about or take lightly, but they were actually painful. And Max has mirrored to me things like ridicule or sarcasm, that is deeply impactful to the feeling being child, and it hurts. And because he has so much of his own self-trust, he's able to mirror that back to me. And so that has helped me to recalibrate my own emotional metabolism.
When self-trust is not established, no one has spoken or written more eloquently than the wonderful psychologist Alice Miller. Alice Miller was a Swiss psychologist and psychoanalyst of Polish Jewish origin who suffered the ravages of non-relational parents and the Holocaust. She survived, and for more than 40 years engaged children in order to see the effects of parenting and education on their lives. Universally acclaimed for changing the way we approach children, she was, in a word, brilliant, compassionate, and certainly prescient about the future of a world without proper care for children. Listen to these chilling words written around 2005. Quote, "Poisonous pedagogy is a phrase I use to refer to the kind of parenting and education aimed at making that child into an obedient subject by means of overt or covert coercion, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. There is a good deal that would not exist without poisonous pedagogy. It would be inconceivable, for example, for politicians mouthing empty cliches to attain the highest positions of power by democratic means. But since voters, as children, would normally be capable of seeing through these cliches with the aid of their feelings, were specifically forbidden to do so in their early years, they lose this ability as adults. The capacity to experience the strong feelings of childhood and puberty, which are so often stifled by child-rearing methods, beatings, and even drugs, could provide the individual with an important means of orientation with which he or she could easily determine whether politicians are speaking from genuine experience or merely parroting time-worn platitudes for the sake of manipulating voters. Our whole system of raising and educating children provides the power-hungry with a ready-made railway network they can use to reach the destination of their choice. They need only push the buttons that parents and educators have already installed. By the time we learn to think conceptually, a functional emotional mechanism is already in place. The nature of that emotional mechanism will determine in many respects precisely how we think and what and when we finally do. End quote.
Vi, you just said something inciting the quotation by Alice Miller. You just said that children can lose this ability as adults. And I wonder if that's actually true. Do we actually, when we're conditioned so thoroughly not to respect our feelings and not to feel all of our feelings, and we're actually forbidden to do so in our early years, is what she said in this quote, we lose this ability as adults. And I question that. What do you say to that?
It's a question you and I have dealt with many times over the years. I think our work has shown that it can be deeply buried and that excavation has to happen. I think given Dr. Miller, and I'm guessing here, but seeing Dr. Miller's background, she could see where having lost it, especially with beatings and some of the horrors that she went through. But I would say that it gets buried. And if it's reinforced and reinforced continually, and then the institutions, such as the political institutions, religious institutions, the economic and business communities, if they reinforce that conditioning over and over and over again, excavation gets much more difficult.
Well, I wonder if we're saying that in its relationship with children that supports healthy development of trust and the organization of a healthy emotional metabolism, wouldn't relationship also be possible for adults to allow that buried self-trust to re-emerge and come back to life? Or is it possible to actually kill a human capacity?
Again, I don't think it can be killed. In my fond hope, how many parents, most parents, they have that child, the newborn child in their arms, and they feel an overwhelming, completely mystical and powerful love that just courses through them. And all of a sudden, this small squealing package they would throw themselves in front of a car for. So I had always hoped deeply that that love would carry through in their lives. But parents face a difficult question, and that's what natural learning relationships is all about. It's all about that parents, if they just stop and presence themselves in the things of which we're speaking, in the attitudes, in the authenticities, and so on, of which we're speaking, and they make the effort to be inspired and take their child into inspirational worlds and so on, then well-being will come forward. It will. And well-being is much stronger than almost every pathology and every confusion and conditioning out there. But it takes intentional effort.
Yeah, that's the important ingredient. I found this in my research as well, that it doesn't just happen unless we actually put ourselves in the position of making strong intentional effort and going up against habit, going up against knee-jerk responses, and really addressing and differentiating ourselves from our past and really starting to move into supporting children that we then can, in a new way, and not the way we were punished or, as Alice Miller said, forbidden in their early years to have these feelings. We really have to go up against that with intentional effort.
So you've said something else that needs to be furthered, and that is we almost always get a twinge that something's off. And that's one thing you noticed tremendously in your research, but we've noticed totally over the many programs we've done over the many years, is
True.
we get a twinge. Wait a minute, this isn't right. Parenting like parents parented. I hated high school. Whatever it might be. I hated high school was a particularly unfond memory. Yes, very personal. But we'll go ahead and just go for it. Instead, we need the support. How many people, Josette, have said, oh, I've taken an NLR, natural learning relationships, into my home and it's working. But then when my in-laws come over, we don't do that because of their expectations. And this is not a disparaging remark about in-laws. It's that the passed down
Habits.
conditioning, the habits, the yearning to love our in-laws will allow us to inhibit bringing the well-being forward, even if it's difficult conversations.
So many times in my research, people would say, I noted these words would just come out of my mouth before I even realized it. And it's a voice that was my mother's or my grandmother's or my aunt's way back there. And I realized as soon as it came out of my mouth that it's not what I wanted to say. And I've had people say to their children, wait a second, pause. I want to take a break. I made a mistake. Please let me take those words back. And what I really want to do is say this, and then they'll correct themselves. And kids love and respect that. And it's not a mistake to let children know that you've made a mistake and you want a do-over. And so it's important to let children understand that we also make mistakes, and that does not deteriorate trust. As a matter of fact, it builds trust with our children. So, should I close now, or you want to say something further on this?
I mean, I could speak for the next 3 hours on this, but it is time. And the listeners, thank you, listeners, for putting up with us, because thank you for the whole participation in this.
I guess what we're seeing is that self-trust is something that we can't really hand a child like as a lecture. It's something that emerges when relationships of honesty really support healthy development. And when a child is met in their feelings and guided without fear, oh, did I do this wrong? Or did I ruin my child forever? But they're allowed to act and learn and connect to meaning beyond themselves. Self-trust becomes the ground that they stand on. They can begin to trust their feelings, their perceptions, their ability to adapt and learn and place within a meaning, and their place within a meaningful. And from that ground, so much becomes possible. Healthy relationships, discernment, autonomy, compassion, well-being, that's the work. That's our responsibility. And that's the opportunity in front of us.
And so, friends, we've come to the end of the podcast. The next podcast, which will be posted in 2 weeks, focuses on what makes natural learning relationships transformative. We clarify what distinguishes natural learning relationships from conventional parenting strategies and the underlying principles that make the approach developmentally sound, relationally coherent, and sustainable over time. In the meanwhile, visit our webpage, www.transformativedynamics.org, to learn more about natural learning relationships and our dual certificate program. There you can learn all you need to know about joining our next cohort, which is forming now. This is Bob Lovemore.
And Josette Lovemore.
And Brandy McCrae.
Wishing you optimal well-being for you and your loved ones. Dedicated to all children, everywhere and always. See you in 2 weeks.